and this is based off of the only thing that we knew is we'd seen the trailer, and there were some early reviews that came out that were kind of negative on the thing. And then we saw Vince McMahon frustrated at his portrayal that he tweeted out on, Monday night. So did that jive with what you thought for the first 4 episodes? What did you think?
Well, one thing, and we talked about this earlier, I was told that it's probably not a good idea to judge this until seeing episode 6.
Mm-hmm.
All of them. So I don't want to judge anything other than my thing that I know I told you and I've told other people before this ever even aired was that I expected that the people who hated Vince McMahon would think that this was too easy on him, and the people who loved Vince McMahon would be absolutely furious about the documentary because they would think that it was unfair to him. And when I watched it, I thought that's probably going to be the reaction. It's going to be across those lines. If you like Vince McMahon, you're going to think they did a hash job on him, which they didn't. If you hate Vince McMahon, you're going to think that they were too easy on him. I mean, there's points where they could have been harder on him, without doubt. But I would have, you couldn't be too, I guess you could be too easy on him, but this is not the documentary that's too easy on him. There were there was not anything new and breaking that people who studied Vince McMahon, would find out. There were 2 or 3 things that I learned that were new, that were minor things. One not so minor, which would be Kay Koplovitz saying that in 1994, when Vince was on trial, if he'd been convicted, they were going to kick him off if he'd been convicted. I don't know if that's true. She did say that, and I was very surprised. I only know of one station, which is KTVU in San Francisco, that dropped WWE because of a steroid, thing. That is the reason they dropped the show. But I think they were the only station in the country that did that. For whatever reason. WWE Raw was not, if we go to 1984, it was a successful show. It was not the success it would be 5 years later. WWE in 1994 was, at a low point, business-wise. So it is possible, and I do know, factually, in 1997, that, the decision was made to drop Tuesday Night Boxing and Monday Night Raw. Barry Diller made that decision. He didn't want them on USA anymore. And before the axe fell, Raw suddenly turned its ratings around, and they decided, they did cancel Tuesday Night Fights, but they did not cancel Monday Night Raw.
Well, going back to that time frame, 94, with business being down as well, you could justify just being like, why are we dealing with this stuff if it's not even doing as good as it did before? When it came to thinking of dropping it, if Vince did get locked up or did lose the trial.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. At the time, syndication was still in '94. Syndication was still more important than cable. That changed over the next really year or two. So it would not have been a death blow, but it would have been a bad blow. They probably would have gotten. There's so many cable stations. They probably would have gotten TV somewhere. They were strong enough. But does that change the issue of wrestling? Absolutely, it does. Absolutely. And there's a lot of different things in that documentary where if they'd gone different ways, history would be different. If 1992 and the stuff that broke in 1992 happened in 2024, it would have been a disaster for the company. A complete disaster, far more than Vince leaving was. Vince leaving was certainly bad PR for the company, but business-wise, it was beneficial to the company. So,
now Vince said that he saw an early cut, and he didn't think that they were fair, and they were using producer tricks to make him look bad. Did you see any of that in the first 4 episodes?
Not producer tricks, no. I think some of it was Vince would say something and somebody would correct him.
I mean, that was kind of your role in the whole thing. You were kind of the gatekeeper of the truth in at least the first 2 episodes.
Yeah. So maybe that's what he's referring to. I don't know. Editing tricks. He says what he says, and some of it's accurate, and some of it isn't. I will say this. I thought Bret Hart was very good.
He could be a little over the top, though, at the same time.
At certain points, I think that when they recounted Survivor Series, I did think, because they spent so much time on it, I thought it really, they needed, you can't discuss Survivor Series unless you're going to do like 5 seconds on it and just pass it through. It's like whatever. If you're going to do a discussion on Survivor Series, Bret's contract and the fact that he had creative control has to be part of it. And when it's not, you're basically giving people a story of Bret Hart. Bret Hart refused to do business. He refused to lose Shawn Michaels and everything like that. And it's like, it is obviously a lot more complicated than that. And that also wasn't his last day. And they also, could have, I thought that that was not, I thought there were 2 or 3 points in the Bret Hart Survivor Series story that needed to be there that weren't there. So if I had most of what I watched, I'm watching going like, yeah, that's what happened. I didn't see any inaccuracies. I as far as, I guess the Hogan Andre story, but I know
all that Hogan stuff was like all the stuff that we didn't like from the Andre doc was he just repeated himself in this one.
Yeah. It's interesting because Hogan, one of the things, Hogan has always denied that he was the person who snitched to Vince about Jesse Ventura.
Yeah.
And here he absolutely said, "Oh yeah, I went right to Vince."
And didn't he kind of also admit to agreeing to testify against Vince in a specific way and then not doing what he said he was going to do at the same time?
Yeah. He told the feds what he was going to say, and then he went on trial. Then in the trial, he said the exact opposite, which I remember just looking at the faces of those guys when Hogan was answering those questions, and it was like they did not expect this. And Vince was still mad at Hogan. Afterwards for doing it, it's like, Vince, he saved your ass.
Yeah.
Hogan was the star witness because he was the one who was going to prove the distribution, and then he just bailed on it. And Hogan, people don't know, Hogan did say that they threatened basically to lock him up. What happened was they had a case against Hogan, and it was for distribution, from way, way, way back. And they didn't want Hogan. They wanted Vince.
Yeah.
So it was basically, we'll give you immunity to testify against Vince. He took the immunity. He got the immunity. And then at that point, he did not testify against Vince and save Vince in that trial. But you know what? Even if Hogan had testified the way they expected, the reality is that they didn't have venue, and it still would have been thrown out. If Hogan had said they had a close case if 2 or 3 things had happened differently. And the key one is Linda McMahon being tipped off. Which also
was not.
As far as that was not in the piece when they talked about the steroid trial, was Linda McMahon being tipped off, and they did sort of mention. I think that was Dave Shoemaker kind of mentioned, jury tampering, which there was no jury tampering, but as far as witness tampering, the allegation essentially that Laura Bravetti, who was one of Vince's attorneys, was secretly married to a guy who was, had come to Emily Feinberg, who was another major witness against Vince, and basically was going to write a bio, help her with maybe a movie role, a movie series on her life or a book or whatever. But he portrayed himself as a reporter for 60 Minutes who was going to help her, and he was not a reporter for 60 Minutes. And he actually portrayed himself to me as a reporter for 60 Minutes, but it was his brother who was a reporter for 60 Minutes. I mean, during the whole thing when this was going on, this is why, like, in that case, like, I know that, like, that the Vince side and everything like that is all bullshit. It's all bullshit, right? Except they came to me. The same guy came to me, who was Laura Bovetti's husband, talking to me all through this, and it's just like, when Laura Bovetti cross-examined Emily Feinberg, who was the strongest witness against Vince, I'm watching this going like, this woman has ESP. She knows everything, she knows everything that Emily Feinberg is going to say. How is this? And then months later, after the trial, there was the article by Jack Neufeld and Phil Nushnick, where it's like, Emily Feinberg was, told her whole story and was being, thought she was going to be represented by this guy who was the husband of Vince's lead attorney, lead attorney, because Laura Bovetti was actually lead attorney, not Jerry McDevitt. I mean, they were both. It was kind of equal, but Laura was the more intimidating and in some ways the more impressive of the two. Jerry was more impressive when it came to knowledge of steroids and tearing Gary Wadler, who was the government steroid expert, tearing him up on the stand, and their steroid expert. I mean, and he had helped the government win certain trials, and I was not impressed by him. I mean, I'd have torn the same guy up. You know what I mean? I mean, he was just he was not an expert. He was not an expert on this in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And that what you're talking about is, and we'll get to episode 2, which was probably the best episode of the 4. And what Shoemaker was basically saying is that after Vince gets off, that he sort of thinks of himself as kind of invincible and indestructible and a good person. And what happened is like the portrayal of what Vince thought he was going to be looked at, it was the opposite. People didn't see him as this conquering hero. They just saw him as like this shady guy who got off.
Well, I mean, he thought that he was exonerated in trial, and he was not. If you were at the trial and I was at the trial, he was anything but exonerated. But they didn't have the goods to convict him, and it never should have gone to trial because they didn't have the goods. Even with the Emily Feinberg stuff, they still needed. They needed that Zahorian was hired by Vince and not assigned, and he was going to be hired by Vince. And Vince, in fact, bought steroids from Zahorian, and Hogan, in fact, bought steroids from Zahorian. They had full knowledge he was distributing steroids in the locker room, but he was assigned there by the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission. When the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission dropped assigning doctors and led to the company WWF or WCW, whoever was going to run Pennsylvania, to hire their own doctor. It was not assigned to them. So if Vince had hired the drug dealer to go into his locker room and deal drugs, if that had happened, and it was going to happen, he was hired. And then Linda McMahon was told at a party by certain people that Zahorian's hot takes are from Zahorian, so they cancel Zahorian. He's not the doctor. He never was a doctor at even one show because she got tipped off. If he was a doctor at even one show, they I can't say 100% certain they lost the case, but I believe they would have. Yeah, and then that would have. And if that happened, they kicked off USA Network. It's how all that is. I guess now that I brought that up, the fact of, and they know, they knew this. They just, I guess, didn't feel the Brett contract, and they didn't feel the Linda getting tipped off was important enough. But to me, like in my mind, those are the Linda being tipped off is a giant part of the story because it was what saved Vince in that trial. The Hogan, which they did go into the Hogan stuff, and that was a key part of the trial too. But the biggest thing was Linda being tipped off. And then the other thing with the the Mushnick story, about the they never talked about Laura Bovetti and her husband at all. Right. In that thing, even though Mushnick's there who wrote the exact story, and the story, that's a real story. That actually happened.
Thank you for watching.